politics? Is this part of it? Management of local groups is
one of the most important elements of neoliberal politics has been to remove democracy. If we look at the history of Britain over the 20th century, what you see is that there have been only two moments when there has really been much fundamental change in British society because of the actions of government in ways which are actually better for the people. So you have the extension of the universal franchise, Homes for Heroes idea, which was post First World War. That's when the universal suffrages really comes in. You know, we've suffered in this war, and the idea of a national housing policy starts to come in after the First World War. And then almost everything else that the British state has done to reform British society happened in a remarkably short period after the Second World War. There's gender issues that took place in the 60s and 70s, which were important as well. It's probably worth pointing out that did happen. But otherwise, you can kind of look at the 20th century as being a long process of rolling back democratic social reforms that took place in two little bursts. We got to the point in the 80s where government really started to find ways to get away from democratic control altogether. Privatisation is an obvious early point. The closing down of the social housing market, but with the right to buy, and importantly, not just the right to buy, but the prohibition on local authorities to replace housing stock. So what you do is you take housing out of the public domain. You take what were nationalised industries, core service industries, out of the public domain. And then progressively, you take more and more away from democratic control. And now I am almost always amazed at how little people understand how government works in Scotland just now. The biggest and most influential groups on an enormous amount of public policy are the big agency firms who get brought in to give apparently independent advice on almost every aspect of Scottish government policy. Now, these are part of the financial service sector. And I mean, I've been involved in this. I worked in kind of public policy areas for more than a decade in Scotland from the start of the Scottish Parliament. And I can remember very few decisions which were made, which were not run by or endorsed by, or endorsement was sought from, one of the big four accountancy firms. And I can't remember many examples where they didn't suggest that there should be either outsourcing, privatisation, or various other processes through which they commercialise and marketise public policy.
So is this more like a kind of British version of a big American right-wing think tank influencing policy then?
It's much, much worse. The think tanks are lobbyists. The big four accountancy firms are, in effect, political activists in many regards, with an ideological approach to how to run a country. They don't have to ask permission. They don't have to lobby. They are paid to give their advice to the public sector. And I say again, people keep asking me, why do we keep reorganising the public sector? Why have we just merged all the police boards? And someone said, look at the money. There's, I can't remember the exact number just now, but there was tens of millions of pounds, which was there for payroll, for staff details. And they said, how's that in anyone's interest? And I said, do you think that money's going to the staff? It's not going to the staff. It will probably go to KPMG or one of its offshoots or one of its competitors, who will charge £60 million to manage the process of pushing people into new contracts. The money's not going into people's pockets. Reorganisation and merger is a means for basically sucking money out of the public sector and straight into the private sector. And I don't think people understand this properly. The process of turning the government of Britain into a closed shop of a private enterprise, big finance, is very well advanced. We don't live in a desperately democratic society, and we really don't live in a society where you could look at it and say the general public has much of a say in things, because they really don't.
Okay, so here's the big question. How could independence benefit addressing this democratic deficit that we face?
Well, I mean, it's one important issue which you've got to get your head around immediately when you deal with any problems, which is, first of all, what's the problem? And second of all, why? What's causing it? This is not accidental. This is a project, a programme. You can trace it probably back to, incidentally, the year of my birth, it was not my fault, 1972, when a group around Nixon said the post-World War settlement is going to come to an end and we're going to move into a new phase. And a lot of people identify it with Reagan and Thatcher, but it started before that, and a lot of the worst stuff, the most important stuff, was actually done by Clinton and New Labour. So it's been a long process of creating a different means of understanding what government is for. We now see government primarily, its first interest is to protect wealth. It doesn't see it in that way. It talks about enterprise and growth and the need to ensure that we keep wealth creators and all this rhetoric. But what they're really saying is our first role as a government is to promote wealth, to protect wealth.
So do you think the Chicago School of Economics is basically completely taking control of the government process?
Yes, I'm not going to get too abstract about that. Yes, with tones of Keynesianism still in there. They never really meant that Hayek idea of actual laissez-faire. They've got a more... people have talked about socialism upwards, the idea that society is there to look after wealth creators. The Chicago School's idea of free markets isn't really the truth of what they followed. In actual fact, what they want is rigged markets that are rigged for big competitors with the help of government.
Such as Halliburton in Iraq, for example.
It's not only what the British government has done overseas. In Scotland and in Britain, almost nothing happens in the public sector now without large sums of money immediately leaking out into the legal firms, the accountancy firms, the IT firms, the restructuring firms. There's an entire network. And of course, I've completely missed what they're now calling the service companies. A4E, I've just forgotten the name of the one that does the assessment of disability. Serco, these groups. Government is primarily finding ways to get more and more money out of our pockets and into their pockets. It's not just the big name Iraq reconstruction contracts. It's almost everything these days. Almost every money, every pound that the Scottish government spends, an increasing sum of it seems to make its way into the private sector.
So now, redistribution for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
Britain is a device for transferring wealth from the many to the few. It's the most simple way to understand what the British state is for now. It is for finding ways to make sure that as much money as possible is taken from as many people as possible and given to a small group at the top. And they don't really mind how they do it. Cheap loans is a great way to get money out of ordinary people. It wasn't to help us. The whole low interest rates has got very little to do with helping the members of the public. Not really. It's just a means of making sure that we can still borrow and raise income in ways that can be transferred into the private sector. Now, the question was, how can we challenge this with independence? And this is why I say that why is it happening? What is very important is that a city-state, a mini city-state has developed in London. And this city-state has been incredibly active in setting up structures and means and methods to ensure that it's very difficult to counteract their agenda. So, for example, at UK, they worked heavily to make sure that the Labour Party wasn't radical. They captured the Labour Party through the media, through lobbyists, through the fear that if you cross the CBI, you can't be in a credible government. So they tamed Labour and made sure there isn't really a democratic choice at a UK level. You can't actually choose a different form of social contract in Britain. They have an enormous lobbying power. I mean, I laugh all the time when I hear lobbyists say, we're only here to provide information. Really? Why do you spend such inordinate amounts of money trying to influence public policy if it doesn't work? You're not dumb people. You don't waste money generally.
Although it doesn't work all the time. Just as an example, I spoke to Rosie Kane one time, and she was telling me that when she got into the Parliament, the lobbyists immediately contacting her, like Coca-Cola and people like this, and she's saying, "Don't you realise what party I'm from? Do you want to stop it?" But they didn't.
They never lose in London. Corporate lobbyists almost never lose in London. The important thing is, and this is the essence of what we are facing in Scotland at the moment. The problem isn't Britain. It's absolutely not the people of Britain. The problem is one small social class which has captured a government in London. The problem doesn't actually spread that far outside London, or the heart of the problem. It kind of emanates from there. The reason why, I've not really had any doubts about independence, but if I had any doubts, the straightforward the straightforward analytical reason why I don't think we've got any chance if we don't end up with independence is you have to believe either that the British state can be reformed or that we can set up a state which is less corrupt. And I just don't believe the British state can be reformed. We had a once-in-a-generation chance to do that when Tony Blair was elected in 97. He had the mandate, he had the size, he had the public will to do it, and he did the opposite. He entrenched elite power. He didn't reform it. If that didn't happen in 97, all I'm suggesting is that of all the world centres of power that I know, I can't think of any, apart from Washington and New York, which is more under the control of a military, media and commercial elite which directs policy. So my suggestion is that almost any parliament in Scotland, almost any state that we have, is going to be less under the control of financial interests than London, and partly because they don't care that much about Scotland. We're not an international finance trading state. They're not really throwing their efforts to try and twist our arms. So, of course, all the corporate interests will keep hammering at us, and the CBI Scotland is not going to disappear. It just cannot be as bad as London. And it's the block of the British state and the lack of a capacity to reform it, which means that all the sorts of social reforms, which bluntly, I think 9 out of 10 people in Scotland would now like to see. I don't think anybody, right or left, is happy with the banks, but we know nothing's going to happen because the banks run London. So all the reforms that people generally want to see, I just don't see how they're ever going to come from London. I think Scotland can be really, really interesting. I think we can do the kinds of things that Iceland is trying to do, but the worst case scenario, I still think Scotland can't be as tied up, as corrupt, as in the pocket of big finance as London. It just doesn't seem possible to me. Therefore, the simple act of independence, breaking the stranglehold of the London elite on decision-making and power in Britain, I can't see a mechanism by which this doesn't enable Scotland to do more things, defend the universal welfare state, try to reform the economy to make it less reliant on speculation in finance, and so on. It seems to me almost impossible that these things wouldn't happen in Scotland. And the problem is the British state, the group, the control, the financial conflicts of interest which lie at the heart of London politics.
Great, and if we can just come to the Reid Foundation itself, I'm sure most of the people listening know who Jimmy Reid was, but in case there are some that aren't, could you explain a bit about the man himself?
Jimmy Reid in 2000 set up the Scottish Left Review. It was the start of devolution, and him and a group of others decided that we needed to put ideas out into the public domain, that we needed to have some forum for discussion about what Scotland could be. Now, I became the editor of the Scottish Left Review after the second issue, and over 10 years, we published a lot of strong thinking, good ideas. And I should also mention, by the way, in my day job, I'm a political strategist, a political lobbyist. That's what I did. I ran the Scottish Left Review at night with big utopian ideas, and during the day, I was a political strategist for the university sector, not for the corporate sector, but for them. And I kind of had to admit increasingly over that decade that there was a gap between my day attitude and my night attitude. During the day, if we had a great idea, but it came to nothing, that's a failure. That's not a success. And at night, we were publishing all these strong analysis and ideas in the Scottish Left Review. But to be honest, a lot of it wasn't being picked up by Scottish public debate. So for quite a while, we had been discussing the need to do what works, to do the things that succeed for others. Now, I've always kind of pointed out this. When the right wing wants to get a grip on government, it doesn't create a political party. It doesn't march or rally. It does a sequence of things which works. It puts ideas out. It puts together proposals. It lobbies. It pressurizes. It controls media. It runs campaigns, and it tries to bounce, to bully, and to encourage government to do the things it wants to do.
Do you think this is, also with disaster capitalism, Naomi Klein's theory? Do you think that's tying into it now as well?
Generally, the strength that the left's got is that this endless drive to control public policy has been a mixed blessing for the right, because they've got everything they want and it hasn't worked. it's actually been a bit of a catastrophe. They keep saying deregulate and it keeps failing. So I think in that regard, sometimes too much